I'll try to yell. I'm just getting over a little bit of a cold, so I have to excuse my scratchy voice. My name is Derek Rockwell. I'm going to do the faux pas of presenting and actually introduce myself. I'm Minnesota Nice. It feels weird to stand in front of people and not actually say who I am. So I'm a senior developer at United Health Group. I have the delight to actually use Ruby on Rails in an environment that is generally Ruby on Rails hostile. So yeah, give it a shot. I don't know why it's kind of quiet yet, but I'll just have to yell a little louder and then I won't be able to talk for the rest of my life. So anyway, the conversation of this talk, Rails 4 and a little bit of Ruby 2.2. Redacted on the Ruby 2.2, mostly because Ruby 2 is kind of interesting, but largely a lot of changes in Ruby 2 are just backwards compatible, and you should probably just use it if you're using 1.9.3, garbage collection, more memory. It's good stuff. But before I get into that, I kind of want to know who I'm talking to. So how many of you are Rails developers today? Fair amount of people, cool. How many people would potentially aspire to be Ruby on Rails developers someday? Keep up the good work. And going back to, is anyone developing on Rails 2 still? Yeah. Casey! I'm sorry. You should probably just leave. You should probably just leave. Yeah, there you go. And then are there any non-technical people here who are just looking at understanding more about the direction of Ruby on Rails and understanding whether or not Ruby on Rails is a good direction for their business? Is there any kind of entrepreneurial people? One individual? Cool. All right, so I'll try and make it more of a technical talk then. It sounds like a lot of developers in the room. Obviously, I only have 40 minutes. There's a lot of cool things going on in Ruby on Rails, so I'll kind of keep it high level. I'll be around all day. Feel free to kind of pitch in and ask some questions at the end if we have time. Otherwise, it's going to be pretty quick. So there's about 4 main things of Ruby on Rails 4 that are important. So the first being housekeeping. So they pulled a lot of things out of Ruby on Rails, or Rails 4, only in the sense that they got extracted into new maintainers. So I have a slide coming up that'll go into a little more detail about a lot of the quote-unquote deprecations and things. They changed the deprecation policy, so the actual versioning numbers are different now with Rails 4 going forward. And so now upgrading to Rails 4 is actually going to be a pretty easy endeavor if you're developing in Rails 3.2. So you get to play with all the cool new features that I'll talk to you about and not have to worry about, some of you who have done the Rails 2, Casey, I'm pointing at you, the Rails 2 to Rails 3 upgrade, that'll be much less painful. So that's all good. Another big piece of Rails 4 is just performance tweaks, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about it later, but it's kind of the lie, cheat, and steal approach. So there's not like real inherent Ruby performance increases. There's a little bit of boot time improvements with Rails 4 and Ruby 2, but largely it's things like caching. Rails 4 is thread safe by default, so it supports like doing things like live streaming and branching off with concurrent web servers and a whole bunch of nifty stuff like that. And then turbo links, which actually reduces the latency between clicking on a link on your Rails web page and then actually seeing the next page. So a lot of cool changes there. And then there's a host of new features. Some of them are semantic. Some of them are just making more sense when you're reading your code semantically. So things like the patch variable is a replacement of put, just because it's more standards compliant. Things like concerns help you clean up your code. There's a couple other little features and tweaks like that too. And then Ruby 1.9.3 is now mandatory with Rails 4. You actually won't even be able to run Rails 4 on 1.8.7. So that's probably the hardest part about getting on Rails 4 actually is going, if you're on Ruby 1.8.7, going to Ruby 1.9 will probably be the biggest endeavor for you. Otherwise, it's pretty straightforward. And they do prefer Ruby 2 just because Ruby 2, again, like Rails 4 to Rails 3.2 to Rails 4, is mostly backwards compatible. They just do a lot more stuff with garbage collection and making things work out better. So a little bit of commit status here. I haven't actually looked into this in a while, but there's a lot of changes. So actually, it's kind of nice that there's more deletions than additions. I always am a fan of that when I see that in Rails. So that goes back to having them pulled out a lot of things like sprockets into new maintainers and new GitHub repositories. So that's all good. A lot of just interesting stats. Any Rails contributors in the room? I don't look like a fool when you know what I'm talking about more than I do? Cool. So I'm really excited about Rails 4, largely because, like I mentioned earlier, it's not a hard upgrade. You get to play with all the fun stuff, and you don't have to actually worry about breaking your own old code. It's probably, at most, a week endeavor if you have like a large Ruby on Rails code base. And a lot of the performance tweaks. So you see a lot of proliferation of things like MVC frameworks on the JavaScript on the client side. And there's kind of a lot of noise in that area, and Ruby on Rails is now starting to take notice of that and starting to make a lot of changes that make that client side more responsive. And so I think they're moving in a good direction. I'll talk a little bit about that later. So the housekeeping. So pulling things out of Rails. There's a couple projects out there. I believe I have a list of them coming up that the Rails core team was actually getting in the way of improving. So things like the asset pipeline, there's a whole team that's not the Rails core team that actually maintains that. So when they would do updates, like the Sprockets 3 is actually coming out, which reduces pre-compilation time from about, I think the example they gave was 10 seconds down to 2 seconds. So you ramped it up onto like a Heroku instance or something like that. That can get rid of a lot of anxiety when you're just sitting there. And basically we get fewer P breaks, so that's kind of unfortunate. But mass assignment protection, so doing things like adder accessor in your models is now deprecated, which doesn't mean that you can't do it in 4.0. It's just now that they'll get a nice little warning when you see it, and you have to pull it out into a gem. All these two have been pulled out into individual gems. So if you're using them and you don't have the bandwidth of updating it yet, you can still go ahead and put it in your gem file, and it'll work backwards compatibly. So observers and sweepers, I'll get a little bit about that, but they're no longer relevant given the new caching scheme that's in Rails. So Rails is now going with the Russian doll approach, and so you no longer need to actually have something paying attention to what you have in your cache to expire it and get rid of it when you're done with it. And dynamic finders, just mostly from a active record model that got cleaned up in lieu of using the where syntax. Page action cache, we'll talk a little bit about that. Active resource. So the RESTful kind of find API for searching your models got pulled out. The Rails core team just wasn't using it, so similar to Sprockets, they pulled it out and given it to new maintainers. And performance tests, I actually never used performance tests in Rails. I don't know if that's a bad thing or not, but those got pulled out because seemingly I wasn't the only person not using it. It's still a gem, so if anyone in here was using performance tests, by all means, it's still there. And then hash-based dynamic finders, so they got pulled out because of the 193 requirement as well. So, talk a little bit about the deprecation policy. So the deprecation policy is now 4.0 is a simple upgrade. So they made deprecations, but they didn't actually remove any functionality. 4.0.x is your normal security updates, so you'll see kind of those incremental things that won't have any functionality impact. And then 4.1 is when actually things like whatever basically on these deprecations here will be actually pulled out, and you'll have to update. So I'm kind of excited about the deprecation policy here. It actually, like I said, it gives you a chance to play with features, but not have to worry about breaking your code. And I mentioned a little bit about deprecations. So config.threadsafe. In production, you actually had to turn threadsafe on. And what that basically means is that when your code loads, it was lazy loading code. So if it ran into a piece of code that was no longer, Rails didn't know about, so if you had a user class and you didn't have your user class loaded, then it would pull it up. That's not inherently thread safe. You'll actually run into a case where you get like a deadlock and then your code will lock up. So there's a couple of reasons for going the thread safe route. So action controller live, which we'll talk about a little bit, is actually assuming that you're thread safe. And so Aaron Patterson, one of the Rails core contributors, actually pointed out that we should just be thread safe by default. Rails plugins, so Rails 2 style plugins are now out. In lieu of leveraging bundler and gems. So if you're using Rails 2 style plugins, you gotta pull them out, extract them out. All right, one of the deprecations that you'll see in Rails 4 is the concept of hash-based find. So it was previously possible to do something like this, where you had conditions created on, and so you had a created on the hash. You could add a bunch of other things like updated at, things like that. That actually got pulled out, so we're no longer using that find syntax. We're now using this slightly less verbose where syntax. most of a semantic thing, but something to watch out for if you're going from Rails 3 to Rails 4. If you have things like this, you'll need to update to the new syntax. Same goes for dynamic finders like find all by, find last by, scope by, and all those other kind of little things that'll get you. Be all standardized into the where function. All right, and then match routes. This is actually, so when you could actually put a match, so it was a catch-all route in your routes.rb file that would actually, that's right, I forgot about that. So if I had a route, it was locate ID memify, and I had a specific cat, like cat number 3, and I wanted to memify a cat, it would actually create routes for, put, it would create routes for get, it would create routes for basically all of your HTTP verbs, and that would actually created an issue. So you don't want to necessarily have a get route that you can post to. Rails does some magic in there that can open up some possible vulnerabilities, and so they took that out in lieu of actually being explicit about what your routes are. So now if I have, if this was intended to only be a form and I would only be posting to that, then I would actually do the same statement here in our routes config file, but I would add the via post. So you're being explicit about it, and you kind of whitelist a lot of those vulnerabilities. And alternatively, you can use post here. There's also get, there's also put, and then all as well. If you can still do via all if you wanted the old match behavior, but they got rid of the match keyword there. Attr accessor. So that got pulled out mostly for security reasons. So you can imagine a situation where if you're working on Ruby on Rails and you have a user class, you have an admin flag, and you want your admin flag to work, someone could basically pass in admin1, and now all of a sudden they just created an admin user, and no bueno. So they're actually being a little more clever about it, pulling that functionality out of the model and actually putting it into the controller level. It makes a little more sense from a business logic perspective. It's actually a piece of how the functionality should work from a business domain perspective and not a model. So we no longer have this syntax where we can say, I'll accept a username and a password in the model, and then only accept those here in the controller. It's actually shifted to the concept of strong parameters. So you'll see that in this, we no longer have our attr accessor here, and that further percolates down into the controller where we have this concept of the user params. So params that require user. So this is our set of user params. So things like the username, the password, potentially that admin flag. If this was an admin controller, we may put that in here. But then we can actually specify what elements of that user hash we can actually have inside of that and actually pass through to our method. So admin could be in here, but since permit doesn't actually have admin listed, it'll just ignore admin altogether, and you have a nice secure little system. So that's kind of nice. Yeah?
Any idea how that would work with nested attributes?
Yes, I'll get back to you at the end of that. And then scopes. So the concept of scopes is now, I even forget what to call it, but you basically have to pass in, instead of a scope, instead of just doing this where, you actually have to pass in what's called a block, lambda, whatever you want to call it, something that has to be evaluated. So the gotcha with this kind of example here, where if I want to pull all the recent blog posts, where it's less than 2 weeks old, this is kind of the syntax to do that, but 2 weeks ago only happened when that code was loaded, right? So you could have cases where your code may not be, I don't know, it's been loaded for 5 hours, and all of a sudden this time is no longer accurate. So they updated it to actually do this lambda syntax or proc syntax or whatever. So when you call blog.recent, it'll actually call this method and get the current time from whenever you evaluate it as opposed to when it was loaded, which is a nice little feature that protects a lot of gotchas when you're dealing with time scopes and stuff. This one was kind of an interesting change. So previously you would have things like grab all the comments of a given post, And then you would put in, not quite SQL, but it's basically the table, the field entry from your comments table, and where that was true. So they actually changed the syntax about that a little bit because the way that Rails was interpreting this it was actually parsing this string here and saying, I need to know where this lives, and I know by reading this that it's in the comments table. They're just making you be a little more explicit about it by having the same piece of code, but then saying references. So now we actually put the hash or the symbol that associates the class or the table that we're working with. So small little tweak. So that's the lame stuff.
Still need the comments before the.
What's that?
Still need the table name.
Yep. Mostly because this could potentially be different than this. So you could think of like a many-to-many kind of thing where this could be, this is probably a bad example, but you would probably have child posts. So if you had a post that has a parent and then you want to pull a specific set, this might be parent and this might be children kind of thing. Okay. So performance stuff. So this is kind of the fun, exciting stuff. I don't know if this counts as a lolcat, but I'm going to count it as at least one lolcat. You got to have a Rails presentation without a lolcat. So Aaron Patterson gave a talk a while ago, and he kind of summarized Rails 4's performance-related changes to being lie, cheating, and stealing. So you're going back to, we're kind of lying in the fact that we're using turbo links to just kind of magically reload the page, and we're not actually reloading things faster. We're just loading it differently. And we're cheating in the fact that we're now going about caching differently and making caching easier, and we're stealing by offloading a lot of performance onto the client side, which is what a lot of modern JavaScript frameworks are doing nowadays. So we're kind of mimicking that behavior with Rails. So the first performance change that's kind of nifty is actually active support queue. So queuing is nice because we have things like mailers, and mailers, we would just fire them off, and they would just asynchronously fire off, and they don't want to be blocking, right? Because if your mail server is down or something, you're sitting around waiting for 30 seconds, and your user's like, what the hell? I just got a little spinny bar. So they actually, you would leverage something like a sidekick or something like that before, or a rescue client that would actually take that asynchronously. Now we have the concept of a queue interface, where it actually builds it into Rails. And now all of a sudden, we can actually use the Rails queue object and push things that can be run. So, you could think of it as a queue. So I could put something in an action mailer on the queue. I could pop it off and send it, and it's doing this. Rails will do this automatically asynchronously. It's pretty snazzy. They actually built in asynchronous mailer as well. So now it's by default Rails 4. It'll be, Rails 4.1. They pulled this out for a couple of reasons. Wasn't quite ready for Rails 4 yet. So 4.1, hopefully they'll have it all figured out. But this will be a nice little feature. Instead of having to automatically just go to rescue or sidekick and do something like that, now it'll be built into Rails 4. With that, though, since it's an API, it can actually build right into sidekick or rescue or whatever you're using, or you can use the new one that's built in. They don't recommend using that one because it's kind of like WebBrick or the built-in server that's not exactly production ready. So they recommend that you actually use them like a rescue or a sidekick. And again, not ready until 4.1. Turbolinks. I was trying to find like a funny little robot picture, like Gundam robots or something. That would just like, but I gave up. So, Steve Klabnik, a Rails contributor, kind of made a blog post about, we really need to measure a lot of this stuff. And he actually devised an experiment where he did 1,000 sequential clicks of a link with and without turbolinks. And he found that without turbolinks, he was getting 138 seconds to process, clicking on 1,000 links. And he turned turbolinks on, and now it went to 80. So that's pretty slick. All you did was add in a gem, and now all your pages are loading about, 50%-ish? No, 40% faster. So pretty cool. So what is turbolinks? Basically, what it does is when you click a link on your website, it's not refreshing the entire page. So what DHH and the team at 37 Signals found was that about that 30 to 40% number was actually not compiling, but rendering CSS and JavaScript and stuff. That's basically the same across all your pages. So what if we can just pull the title and the body via Ajax and then just hot swap everything on the page? So that's what they did, and that's how they got about the 40%. A couple of things to just build that in. If you can actually build this into Rails 3, which I've done before, and it's pretty slick. Do your gem, put it in your JavaScript, and then one little caveat. Since the way we traditionally wrote JavaScript is we would have an on-ready listener. Yeah, you're getting ahead of me. So we would have an on-ready listener, right, that when the page was done loading, or like completely loading, that event would fire off, and things like our little carousel, or things like our Facebook links and LinkedIn buttons and all that JavaScript stuff would then populate the page. Well, the way that TurboLinks is loading the page is it's not actually triggering this on-ready event. So what they added was this page load event. So you'll actually have to go into your code if you're using TurboLinks and actually write a little bit of event listener code to change from on-ready to page load. A couple things. There's actually a jQuery.turbolinks gem that you can include that'll do a little bit of that automatically for you. So it'll look for on-ready events and then automatically convert them into page load, which is pretty slick. I didn't have a whole lot of luck with it, but it's still a pretty new project, so hopefully they have figured it out by now. And then also, if you have something that goes to a different site that has a whole new CSS or JavaScript structure that you do need to reload, you can actually put in this data no turbolink equals true, and it'll turn off turbolinks for that and actually disable turbolinks for that, and it'll load all the CSS and stuff again. Another caveat about turbolinks is that it is backwards compatible, so it'll degrade gracefully. So this is leveraging the push state API of HTML5. So if you have an HTML5 incompliant browser, Internet Explorer, then it'll actually just reload the whole page. And our Internet Explorer users will get a crappy internet experience, but they probably should anyway. They should. I mean, yeah, we'll figure it out eventually. Yeah. Yep. E-tags. So Rails convention has a lot of cool things that goes on behind the scenes, and you don't really figure it out until you have to monkey with it. Is anyone familiar with the concept of E-tags? Maybe some of you are Rails devs in here, a couple. So when I saw this, I was like, what? I don't understand. Yes, I stole the slide from you, Matt. Calm down. And then I went out and checked it out, and I was like, what's going on? And they're using some obscure HTTP headers, like if none match and if modified state. And I was like, what's going on? Rails, you're doing magic. I don't understand. So what it basically does is when a user is visiting your site, Rails will create the entire response. So you create your index of blog posts or whatever. It'll turn that into basically a hash code and then send both the response, so your index of blog posts, and they'll send back that E-tag as well. And then the client browser will compare that E-tag to what they saw the last time they loaded that page. And if it's the same hashtag, they'll actually just load from browser cache that page, which is pretty sweet. But the Rails server still has to create that response, even if it was already going to be the same thing. So ultimately, the server's still doing the same amount of work, but the browser gets a little bit of an improvement. So Rails 4 actually changed that a little bit and incorporated the concept of fresh when. So we can actually specify in our controller when to send a new E-tag. And so if we have a post that's new, then it'll generate our E-tag based off that post as opposed to the response. So now we get that E-tag back from our user. We generate a new, I think I actually, nope, I didn't. But we generate our E-tag based off that and compare it to the one that our browser sent. And now we don't need to create a new response because we know that we don't have anything new for them and they can just go straight to loading the one they've got. It's pretty sweet. So I mentioned a little bit that they changed the caching scheme to Russian doll caching. It's a pretty interesting topic, but I don't know if I have enough time to talk about it. But basically, it was the concept of when you have subpages, like you might have a template for your blog, you might have a template for an index that has those blogs, and then if you change your blog post, then all of a sudden your cache for the index changes too. And so when you change your deep level of your nested cache, you have to go back up and then change all those. And so that got kind of hairy the way that it was done before. So you would kind of have to version each one. Well, versioning's a different story. But actually going into the versioning piece, so it was pretty smart about caching things. So you could put these little things like cache post, and that'll throw your post into a cache. And so every time they load that page, if the post is the same, it'll just load from cache, which is a good story. Rails doesn't have to do as much work. But it didn't cache the template. So if you had your post.html.erb, but you were changing the way that you were presenting that template, so let's say you moved the title from here, and now it's over here, it was actually caching that whole template. So it would still load no matter how many times you changed post, it would still load it so your post title is over here as opposed to over here. So the way to fix that was to incorporate the concept of versioning. So every time you changed your template, you would have to say it's no longer over here, it's now over here, here's version 2 of my template file. And that got kind of out of hand pretty quickly, and you had to pay attention to all of that. And you also had to pay attention to how it cascaded. So if you had deep level nested caches, now you had to version all of them, and they had to go up the stack, and it was just goofy. So Rails 3 caching was kind of obnoxious, pain in the ass, frankly. Just hang on. I'm on the record. Oh well. Another wet. I love this picture. So they incorporated the concept of cache digests. And so now all you do is cache post, do post. And that takes care of all the versioning things, because now the way Rails caches this is it actually appends an MD5 of what that response was. And so now your template file and how you change your template is now reflected in your cache, and you no longer have to worry about versioning. So now all of your caching works just wonderfully. Cool story. So, Action Controller Live. There's a segment of use cases in the web where you would go, let's use Node. And Rails developers would kind of look at you and be like, don't use Node. But we never had a solution for them to not use Node. So this is kind of the concept behind Action Controller Live. So if I wanted to create a chat room or something like that, you might have to have some JavaScript that would poll for changes every once in a while and do some sort of Ajax magic. Or you could leverage something like Fey. I haven't personally used Fey, so I can't really speak to it very much. And then there's the concept of WebSockets, which is an HTML5 deal, which is okay, but Rails doesn't have a lot of support for WebSockets yet. And it looks like we probably won't go on kind of the Action Controller Live route. So screw all that. We're going to do it live. I love that picture. Fuck it. Is this a PG-13 conference? I'm sorry. Anyway, so there's a significant amount of code that goes along with this, unfortunately, so bear with me. First step, obviously you have to throw in the Action Controller Live, mix that into your code. If we have a new controller event method, the first thing we have to do is write to that stream. So we write our header to the stream and tell it that it's an event stream. Event stream is the HTML5 kind of library for doing server-side events. And there's a JavaScript library that we'll talk about here in a moment that corresponds to that. I'm leveraging Redis here to kind of do, we're subscribing and listening for any sort of changes in events. So I can actually push changes to my Redis server, and then Redis will let me know when those changes have happened. And so then we can push it down to whoever is on our website. So here we're checking for any time a message is created, we get a message from Redis. And then on our message, we will write this pair of event and data. We'll write it out to our client, and our client is happy. We'll close things down and make sure that when you're leveraging Action Controller Live that you're actually closing your connections to the stream. Otherwise, your stream just sits there forever, and that's bad news. And then our create code. So when we create a message, it's pretty standard the way we might have created a message before. We send a little post with a little form. We'll create a message in our chat room. It says, hi, I'm at a conference talking about Rails. Hooray. We do our permits and names. We publish it to Redis, which will then fire off the subscribe because it notices a new message. We pull the JSON, write the JSON down in here. And then in the client side, we can subscribe to that via, oops, sorry. Did I do that too much? Oh, don't even do this to me right now. Once? Yes. All right. So yeah, and I'm evidently not using turbolinks, so don't use that code. So a little bit of code here that says on update. So basically this is just saying add this event listener to every time we get a message, call this update method. And this update method will pull that AJAX that we sent through and create a new item in our chat room and append it. And so that all works automatically. I wanted to put a demo together, but I didn't have nearly enough time to actually go through a demo, unfortunately. 40 minutes is not a long time. Okay. So a couple caveats to that. Your code has to be thread safe. It's kind of the inherent thing with having things that are waiting and listening for a long time is you have a high chance of things going over the same piece of code and the data can change, and that's going to be bad news. So that's a good reason why Rails 4 now has thread safe on by default in production. So use thread safe code. One of the wonderful Rails, I consider Rails developers, Charles Nutter. He's a local Minneapolis guy, wrote a thread safe gem that's got a lot of thread safe arrays and thread safe hashes that'll help prevent that. And you can use locks and stuff. And so since this is spawning off threads, you have to use a thread safe server. Thin or Puma are kind of the de facto ones right now. There's a couple weird things with Puma, like I think it still only has 16 concurrent threads at a time. So that could get in trouble. Yeah, actually, that's a good point. WebBrick is surprisingly thread. It's concurrent. I bet you didn't know that, did you? So, and then Heroku uses WebBrick by default. So people that don't actually specify if they're using Heroku and they don't use Thin or Puma or anything like, or Unicorn, they're actually using WebBrick on Heroku, which just makes me confused. But whatever. And make sure you write your headers first. If you don't write your headers first, it won't work. And close your streams when you're done. All right. So those are the performance changes. Any kind of questions on that? I think I'm running ahead of schedule, so I'm good. Cool. New features. So model none. So there are a couple instances where in Rails 3, I would write some code like this, check if a user is banned. If they were banned, I wouldn't show them any posts. Otherwise, show them all the published posts. It's pretty standard. It's not super clean, because then that percolates up your code. Now I have to check every time if there's post to show, then I can do a dot recent on those posts, and otherwise render nothing, because I can't do a dot recent if they don't exist. You can't do a dot recent on an empty array, which is what this will return if they're banned, and so now I have to check, and just a mess. So Rails 4 accounts for this by adding the feature of model.none, and so now I can do actually post.none instead of an empty array. And now post.none, since that's actually an active record or active relation object, then I can go ahead and do dot recent and not have to do this if else end, and cleans up a little bit of code, which is pretty slick. Similar kind of case for relations not. So sometimes you had to wrap your code in a little bit of magic here that would actually have to rewrite your SQL. So if you were checking a case where author could be an empty array or doesn't exist or something, you would have to say author does not equal author. And so if my author is Derek and I'm checking this, I want to make sure that the author does not equal Derek. But if I never had the author set, then I would have to do is not null. These are two different SQL queries. If I didn't have this if else at the end, then I would run into an issue where I try to do author does not equal null, and that actually doesn't work. So you would have to go ahead and write the spaghetti code here. Rails 4 automatically handles that for you, where .not, and so it basically effectively will rewrite the SQL queries depending on what you're using. Pretty slick. Concerns. Did anyone read that crazy article about DHH proclaiming that concerns are the way of the future? That was kind of a whole Ruby drama ordeal. Whatever. That's an architecture perspective, but this is actually the routes perspective. So a lot of routes would be like post/comments, post/categories, post/tags. Articles might have some of those same resources and attributes and configurations and what have you. So a way to clean this up and DRY, dry it out, would be to go to Rails 4 and do concerns. So we may have a sociable concern. That sociable concern would lay out, comments, categories, and tags. And now we can specify that our posts has this sociable concern. Articles has our sociable concern as well. What time is this done? I don't even know. 3:20? 3:30? Oh, crap. All right. Got some flash types. You can add new flash types. Hooray. So open bar. If there was an open bar, I want to alert to it and probably cancel this talk because I'm leaving because I need to be drunk soon. Off the record, scratch that. Active model, there are cases where if you had a contact form or something that you don't want to persist to a database, then you can actually use active record to do things like validation of whether or not these fields exist. So you include this active model code. Now you can actually fire that off, and you don't have a database corresponding to it at all. You can just fire it off. HTML5 helpers, these are still fairly unsupported, so I wouldn't recommend using them, but Rails is starting to support things like weak helpers, color pickers, day fields, blah, blah, blah. It'll actually use the HTML5 output, so you don't have to use. I would still recommend using the jQuery stuff, but. Collection helpers. Before, you could only do collections of drop boxes. Now you can actually do radio boxes and check boxes. Pretty slick. All right, those are the new features. Really quick, miscellaneous stuff is pretty slick. You can use Postgres, HStore, so you can do your NoSQL-esque queries. You can actually write JSON and stuff as opposed to having to parse a string that came out of Postgres. Now you can actually use native JSON. Pretty slick. The patch verb, again, this is a semantic change. Put was actually kind of being used in a way that didn't make sense. Put was supposed to write entire objects to a database as opposed to updating a couple fields. So patch is a little more semantic. This is a backwards compatible change. So they duplicated the update routes to use patch and put. Index.html no longer exists. It's all dynamically generated. Huzzah. So when you create new projects, you no longer need to actually delete your index.html page. There's actually a commit that just happened. I think they got rid of the Rails PNG file, which is pretty awesome. So one less step of doing crazy things when you're building products. Here's a DHH power trip for you. Evidently, underscore filters wasn't good enough, and so now they're underscore actions, which kind of makes sense because before filter was kind of ambivalent. You didn't really know what that meant. And what it was really doing was acting before an action in your controller. So now it's renamed to, before filter is now before action. It's still backwards compatible. That's a minor change. Ruby template handler. So before, if you're writing a JSON API, you might be using JBuilder. Now you can actually write it in straight Ruby. So we have a post we formatted as JSON for our little API client. We can actually, this is all straight Ruby, and we can specify we only want the name and the URL. So we map our owner fields there, generate a list of owners, and then spit it out as JSON, and we don't have to use JBuilder anymore. It's pretty slick. The test directories have changed because the way we were writing tests was kind of goofy. So Rails 3 had functional tests. They're now called controller tests because that's what we were basically using them for anyway. Performance no longer exists because that got deprecated. Unit is now models. That makes more sense. We're actually testing models. Helpers got added. It used to live within unit optionally. There was never a place for testing your helpers. Now there is a place, which is good. And then installing Rails 4. So Rails 4 is currently in beta 1. They still don't have an ETA on the roadmap as to when RC1 even or P0 is going to be launched. Whatever they call it. I don't even know what their release versions are called. But still a TBD on release, but you can actually generate a new gem set and install beta 1 and start playing around with it. A lot of gems are actually compatible with Rails 4 now, so you can start messing around, create a branch for your Rails 3 application, mess around with it, see what happens, run your tests, and see what explodes. And really quick, I'm done. That was really, I think I got a little bit of time left, so. And I have 3 quick pitches. First of all, Rails MN, I am co-organizer of Rails MN. We're a user group that's aiming to help educate people and welcome people into the Ruby on Rails community. So we have sessions on the second Monday of each month, and we have about 2.5 hours to kind of do, an introductory lecture, and then we do a little bit of hands-on coding, and then we do kind of an advanced topics class about Rails stuff or general web development stuff. Sponsored by Coco and Google for Entrepreneurs as part of their new partnership, which is pretty slick. They give us free beer and pizza, so if there's nothing else, there's that. Ruby MN, obviously, our local community of Ruby developers, not to be confused with Rails.nl. We're 2 different groups. Rails is kind of the earlier stage of that, and hopefully bringing them more people into the Ruby MN community. Ruby MN has a lot of great presentations about, lightning talks about what people are doing with things like Ruby Motion. Slick group if you're a Ruby developer or an aspiring Ruby developer. Definitely check out our groups. And as a United Health Group employee, we are actually hiring Rails developers. So if you know anyone, and we're also hiring designers, please contact me, and that's my spiel. I don't know if I have time for questions or not. Thank you.